Microsoft's own CEO just called Game Pass too expensive. Her words, not mine. And she'd know, because 6 months earlier, her own company raised the price 50%, from $19.99 a month to $29.99, and watched subscribers cancel in droves. Now they're yanking Call of Duty off day one. That's not a strategy. That's damage control. Back in 2017, Microsoft was convinced it had cracked the code. The pitch was simple, and it was seductive. One monthly fee, and you'd get a whole library of games the same way Netflix gave you a library of movies. No more $60 or $70 every time something new came out. Just pay once a month and play everything. Microsoft called it the future of how people would buy games, and for a while, almost everyone believed them. Behind closed doors, the ambition was even bigger than the marketing. According to documents that later leaked during a federal court fight, Microsoft had set itself a target of 100 million Game Pass subscribers by 2030. 100 million. That's not the kind of number that just grows a business. That's the kind of number that rewrites an entire industry around your model. And reportedly, the man at the very top, Satya Nadella, had been so unsure about gaming that he'd considered walking away from Xbox entirely back in 2021. The 100 million dream was a big part of the case for staying in. So Microsoft went all in. In 2023, it closed the biggest deal in the history of video games, $75 billion for Activision Blizzard, the studio behind Call of Duty. The logic was clean. Put the most popular shooter on Earth onto Game Pass on day one, and the subscribers would have to follow. Halo never got them to 100 million. Maybe Call of Duty could. And here's the part that makes all of it land harder. The man selling this vision, Xbox chief Phil Spencer, wasn't just optimistic in private. Back in 2018, he went on the record and told the press that putting games on Game Pass didn't hurt their sales. It actually increased them. Free publicity, he called it. Get people playing and they'll buy. He pointed to Forza and to State of Decay 2 as proof it was already working. By now, every promise was stacked on top of that one belief. The subscriptions would scale to 100 million. The biggest games on the planet would lead the charge. And somehow, giving your game away cheap to millions of subscribers would sell more copies, not fewer. There was just one problem with all of it. Almost none of it turned out to be true. And the first crack didn't show up in a leaked memo, or a courtroom, or a developer's angry tweet. It showed up in the one number Microsoft could never spin. That number was subscribers, and for years, Microsoft treated it like a state secret. When Game Pass launched, the growth was real. It hit 10 million subscribers by 2020, then kept climbing, and Microsoft loved to talk about it. Then, somewhere around 2024, the talking mostly stopped. Here's why. By early 2024, Game Pass had crawled to about 34 million subscribers. 2 years later, in early 2026, it sat at roughly 40 million. That's it. A few million in 2 years on the service that was supposed to reach 100 million by 2030. Sit with that for a second. The goal was 100 million by 2030. It's 2026 and they're at 40. Less than halfway there with 4 years left on the clock and the growth nearly flat. To hit that target now, Game Pass would have to add more subscribers in the next 4 years than it has in its entire existence. Now hold those numbers up against the company it was named after. Microsoft sold Game Pass as the Netflix of gaming. Netflix has 325 million subscribers. Game Pass has 40. The thing it was built to copy is more than 8 times its size and still growing, while Game Pass has flatlined. And it gets worse because you don't even have to reach for Netflix. Look at the guy across the street. Sony's PlayStation Plus, the rival service Game Pass was supposed to bury, has over 51 million subscribers. That's more than Game Pass, on a console that's outsold the Xbox by more than 2 to 1. Now remember, this is all after Microsoft spent $75 billion buying Activision Blizzard just to drag Call of Duty onto the service and force those numbers up, $75 billion, and the line on the chart barely twitched. So here's what you're left looking at. A service promised to hit 100 million, stuck at 40, named after a company 8 times its size, beaten by the rival it was built to beat, propped up by the most expensive deal in gaming history and still going nowhere. The obvious question is why? With infinite money, the biggest games on Earth, and almost a decade of runway, why did the number just stop? Microsoft will point to price, or tiers, or bad timing. But the real reason Game Pass can't reach 100 million has nothing to do with any of that. It comes down to the one thing nobody there wants to say out loud. Gaming isn't television, and the math was never going to work. Start with how people actually use these two things because that's where it falls apart. When you subscribe to Netflix, you graze. You watch a few episodes of one show, get bored, jump to a documentary, then a movie, then something your partner picked. In a single month, you might touch 8 or 10 different things, and none of them cost Netflix much to let you stream. You stay subscribed because there's always something new to graze on, and you keep paying month after month for years. Gaming doesn't work like that, and it never has. When a gamer finds the game they want, they don't graze. They commit. They'll sink 40, 60, 100 hours into one title over a month or two. They're not browsing a buffet, they're eating one enormous meal, and when they finish it, a lot of them do the rational thing. They cancel, and they wait for the next game worth their time. Netflix keeps you because you never run out of things to half-watch. Game Pass loses you the moment you beat the one game you came for. That alone would be a problem. But the thing that truly breaks the model is what those games cost to make. A single episode of a Netflix drama runs somewhere between $5 and $10 million. A whole prestige season, $50 to $100 million. Now look at a modern blockbuster game. A AAA title routinely costs $200 million to build, and the biggest ones run toward $500 million before marketing even starts. One game. Years of work, hundreds of developers, every dollar spent before a single copy is sold. So here's the asymmetry no monthly fee can fix. Netflix spends tens of millions on a show, then lets tens of millions of people stream it for pennies each. The math works. Microsoft spends $200 to $500 million on a game, then hands it to subscribers on day one for the price of a couple months of subscription. The math doesn't just struggle, it inverts. And it gets sharper. If a Netflix show flops, they're out $50 million, and they've still got hundreds of other shows keeping you subscribed. If a Microsoft game flops, they're out $500 million, and they needed that one game to be the reason you didn't cancel. Netflix can absorb 10 failures and keep printing money. Microsoft can't absorb 2. This is the exact part Microsoft spent years insisting wasn't true. That you could give your biggest games away on a subscription and somehow come out ahead. They said it didn't hurt sales, they said it helped. But when regulators forced them to open their own books, the numbers told a very different story. And it was Microsoft's own data that gave the game away. In 2018, the head of Xbox stood in front of the press and made a promise. Phil Spencer said that putting a game on Game Pass didn't cost you sales, it made you sales. He called it free publicity. Get 1 million people playing your game on a subscription, he argued, and word of mouth does the rest. They tell their friends, the buzz spreads, and the people who aren't subscribed go out and buy it. He pointed to Forza Horizon 4 and State of Decay 2 and said, "Look, it's already working." That was the story for years. Game Pass is good for developers, it grows the pie, don't worry about your sales. Then Microsoft tried to buy Activision Blizzard, and regulators started asking hard questions. To answer them, Microsoft had to hand over its own internal numbers, the ones it never meant for you to see. And what those documents showed was the opposite of everything Spencer had said in public. Britain's competition regulator, reviewing Microsoft's own data, concluded flatly that Game Pass, quote, severely cannibalizes buy-to-play sales, especially for newer releases. Not helps. Cannibalizes. And Microsoft's internal analysis spelled out what that meant. When a game lands on Game Pass, its actual sales drop in the year that follows. The company's own books proved the free publicity story was, at best, wishful thinking. Sit with that contradiction for a second. The public message for years was that Game Pass lifted sales. The private data, the stuff they fought to keep sealed, said it ate them alive. You don't need anyone to call that a lie. You just put the two statements side by side and let them sit there. And this wasn't some shocking new discovery in 2023. The people closest to the sales floor saw it coming back in 2018, the same year Spencer was making his pitch. When Microsoft announced its games would hit Game Pass on day one, independent game shops in Britain were furious. One retailer said the move had made his entire Xbox business worthless almost overnight. Why would anyone pay full price for a game, he asked, when they could pay for 1 month of Game Pass and get 100 of them? Some of those shops said they'd stop stocking Xbox altogether and steer their customers toward PlayStation instead. So the warning signs were there from the very beginning. The retailers felt it at the register. The regulators found it in the data. Microsoft's own internal numbers confirmed it. And the only people still insisting Game Pass was good for the business were the people being paid to run it. But none of that stopped Microsoft. Because in 2023, it was about to make the single biggest bet in the history of this industry, on the exact idea its own data said was broken. Why spend that kind of money? One reason towered over all the others: Call of Duty, the biggest, most reliable money printer in gaming. The plan looked brilliant on paper. Put Call of Duty on Game Pass on day one every single year, and millions of players would finally have a reason to subscribe and stay subscribed. Call of Duty would be the anchor that dragged Game Pass toward that 100 million dream. Halo couldn't do it, Forza couldn't do it, but nobody on Earth says no to Call of Duty. In October 2024, it happened. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 launched straight onto Game Pass on day one, the first time ever. And for a few weeks, it genuinely looked like a triumph. Engagement spiked, player counts shot up, and Microsoft crowed about record activity. Then the bill came due. Bloomberg later reported that putting Call of Duty on Game Pass cost Microsoft around $300 million in lost sales in a single year. $300 million gone because the people who would have bought the game for $70 just played it on the subscription instead. It was the exact cannibalization Microsoft's own documents had predicted, and the exact thing the regulators had found. The most valuable franchise on the planet, the one they just paid $75 billion to own, and on Game Pass it was bleeding money. And here's the detail that should have ended the argument forever. Even with Call of Duty free on day one, for every subscriber, the vast majority of people who bought Black Ops 6 that year bought it on PlayStation, the console made by Microsoft's single biggest rival. Not on Xbox. Microsoft owned the game, gave it away on its own service, and Sony's box still moved most of the copies. Step back and look at what that actually means. Microsoft spent $75 billion to buy the one franchise that was supposed to save Game Pass. It put that franchise on the service exactly as planned. And the result was $300 million in lost sales a year, most of the real purchases happening on a competitor's console, and a subscriber count that still wouldn't crawl toward 100 million. This was the strongest possible version of the strategy, the biggest game on Earth, owned outright, deployed exactly the way they drew it up. And it didn't work. If Call of Duty couldn't make the math work, nothing could. But Call of Duty wasn't even the only bet quietly falling apart. Because while Microsoft was pouring billions into games, it had made a second giant wager on the future of how you'd play them. And that one was already dead. For years, the other half of the pitch wasn't just a library of games, it was the promise that you wouldn't even need a console to play them. Cloud gaming, stream a blockbuster to your phone, your laptop, your TV, the same way you stream a movie. No expensive hardware, no downloads, no barrier to entry. This was supposed to blow the gaming market wide open and pull in millions of people who'd never owned an Xbox in their lives. Microsoft built its own version, Xbox Cloud Gaming, and folded it right into Game Pass. So how did that future actually turn out? Look at the graveyard. Google, a company with effectively unlimited money and the best server network on the planet, launched its own cloud gaming service called Stadia. It shut the whole thing down on January 18, 2023. Dead. Google couldn't make it work either. Amazon tried too with a service called Luna. It didn't get shut down, but what happened might be worse. By late 2025, Amazon quietly folded its gaming brand into Luna and moved on, and the service drifted into near-total irrelevance. As recently as 2025, only about 1 in 8 people who actually pay for game subscriptions had even heard of Luna. 1 in 8. For a service from Amazon, one of the most recognizable companies on Earth. And Microsoft's own cloud offering, it's still running. But notice that nobody talks about it as a business. Nobody subscribes to Game Pass because of cloud streaming. It's a feature buried inside the package, a nice little extra, not a reason anyone signs up. The thing that was supposed to expand the entire market quietly turned into a checkbox on a list. So that's 2 enormous bets sitting side by side. Microsoft spent $75 billion on the games to fill the library, and the cannibalization ate the profits. It poured years into cloud as the great market expander, and the whole category turned into a graveyard. 2 different roads to the 100 million dream, and both of them dead-ended. By 2025, Microsoft had a problem it could no longer paper over. The growth wasn't coming. The bets weren't paying off. The math the developers had warned about, the math the regulators documented, the math the company's own books confirmed, was finally catching up to them. And when a company runs out of ways to grow a number, it reaches for the one lever it has left: price. That's when things got ugly. By the fall of 2025, Microsoft finally made its move. On October 1st, it raised the price of Game Pass Ultimate by 50%. Overnight, the top tier jumped from $19.99 a month to $29.99. a 50% increase all at once with almost no warning. The reaction was instant, and it was brutal. Subscribers flooded the cancellation pages, and Cancel Game Pass started trending across social media. People ran the simple math, nearly $360 a year for the top tier, and decided they were done. Microsoft had spent 8 years and $75 billion trying to grow this one number, and in a single decision, it handed millions of people a reason to walk. And the timing could not have been worse. Just months later, in February 2026, Phil Spencer, the man who'd built Xbox over 38 years and championed Game Pass as the future, retired. In walked a new boss, Asha Sharma, an executive poached from Meta, and she inherited the wreckage. What she did next tells you everything. In April 2026, barely 6 months after the hike, Sharma reversed it. She cut Game Pass Ultimate from $29.99 back down to $22.99, and in the same breath, she did something that quietly demolished the entire strategy. She pulled future Call of Duty games off day one. The franchise Microsoft paid $75 billion to put on Game Pass. The anchor that was supposed to drag the service to 100 million subscribers would no longer launch on the service at all. You'd have to buy it, just like the old days. Read that back. They bought Call of Duty to feed Game Pass, then they pulled Call of Duty off Game Pass to save Game Pass. The keystone of the whole plan, ripped back out by the same company that spent a fortune to install it. And then there's the part Sharma put in writing. In an internal memo that leaked to the press, she told staff that Game Pass had simply become too expensive for too many players. In another, she admitted, quote, "Growth slowed down and subscriber loss accelerated after the pricing changes. Growth slowed. Subscribers left." That's the CEO of Xbox putting in writing that the strategy itself had driven people away. Now she never stood up and said the words Game Pass failed. Of course she didn't. No executive ever does. But look at what she actually did. She cut the price. She pulled the anchor game. She admitted, on paper, that the plan had pushed people out the door. You don't need her to say the word. The actions say it for her. This is what a retreat looks like when a company is too big to admit it's retreating. And the most damning verdict of all didn't come from a regulator, or a memo, or a spreadsheet. It came from the people who actually make the games, the ones who saw this coming for years and finally said it out loud. In the summer of 2025, Microsoft laid off thousands of people across its gaming division, part of a wave of cuts that hit studio after studio. And as the industry watched another round of talented developers lose their jobs, a question started getting asked out loud. If Game Pass is such a triumph, why does everyone working under it keep getting fired? One of the first to say it plainly was Rafael Colantonio, and this isn't some random critic. Colantonio founded Arcane Studios, the team behind Dishonored and Prey, games Microsoft itself would later own. He knows the business from the inside. His verdict was blunt. He called Game Pass an unsustainable model that had been quietly damaging the industry for a decade, propped up only by what he called Microsoft's, quote, infinite money. His point was simple. A company can lose money on purpose for a very long time when it's one of the richest corporations on earth, but the bill always comes eventually. And when it does, Colantonio warned, Game Pass can't just coexist peacefully with the rest of the industry. It either kills off the traditional model entirely, or Microsoft gives up. He wasn't alone. Michael Dowse, the publishing director at Larian Studios, the team that made Baldur's Gate 3, one of the most celebrated games of the decade, echoed him immediately. The biggest fear in his circle of developers, Dowse said, came down to one question. Quote, "What happens when all that money runs out?" Because that's the quiet truth underneath the whole thing. The only reason Game Pass works at all is that Microsoft can afford to bleed money on it indefinitely, take the infinite money away, and the model has no foundation left under it. Think about how strange that is. The people who actually build the games, the ones Game Pass is supposedly helping, were the loudest voices warning it was poison. Not because they hate subscriptions, but because they could see the same math in Microsoft's own leaked documents, the same math the regulators found. Give your work away for a flat fee to millions of people, lose the sales, and hope a giant corporation keeps writing checks forever. That's not a business model. That's a gamble with everyone else's livelihood. And here's the thing about gambles like that. Eventually, the other players at the table stopped betting, because it wasn't only the developers who'd run the numbers and gotten nervous. The biggest publishers in the entire industry were watching too. And one by one, when it came time to put their most valuable games on the line, they started saying a very quiet, very deliberate no. Consider the biggest game in the world right now, Grand Theft Auto 6, the most anticipated entertainment release of the decade from Take-Two and Rockstar, a game expected to sell tens of millions of copies and earn billions of dollars, the single most valuable title in the entire industry. This title will not be on Game Pass on day one. Take-Two has been completely clear about this. Its chief executive, Strauss Zelnick, has said flatly that putting a game like Grand Theft Auto 6 onto a subscription service the day it launches simply doesn't make economic sense. The company's position is that it'll only do a subscription deal when the money works in its favor, and for a game this size, it never will. Why hand the biggest launch in history to a flat monthly fee when tens of millions of people will gladly pay full price to play it on day one? And that's the whole argument made for you by the people on the other side of the table. Microsoft spent years insisting Game Pass was good for the games that landed on it, but when the most valuable game on the planet comes up for release, its owner takes one look at the economics and walks the other way. If day one Game Pass were actually good business for a publisher, the biggest publisher with the biggest game would be first in line. Instead, they're first out the door. And this is the pattern right across the top of the industry. The blockbusters that print money, the games people will happily pay $70 for, mostly stay off Game Pass at launch. What's left to anchor the service on day one is largely Microsoft's own first-party games, the ones it can afford to subsidize because it owns the studios. The publishers with the most to lose run the math Microsoft pretends doesn't exist, and they keep their crown jewels far away from the subscription. So now you can see the full shape of it. The developers warned the model was unsustainable, the regulators documented the cannibalization in black and white, the biggest publishers refused to feed it their best games, and Microsoft's own data confirmed every bit of it. Every single party that touches Game Pass, except the company running it, has reached the same conclusion. Which leaves Microsoft in a genuinely strange place, trapped inside a service it can't fix, can't fill, and can't quit. Here's the bind Microsoft built for itself. Game Pass is now the most expensive subscription in console gaming. Even after the price cut, Ultimate sits at $22.99 a month, more than what Sony charges, and Sony's service, PlayStation Plus, has more subscribers and a deeper lineup of the exclusive games that actually sell hardware. Microsoft spent the entire generation telling people Game Pass was the reason to choose Xbox. And at the end of it, Xbox has fewer subscribers than its rival, a console outsold by more than 2-to-1, and a subscription that charges more for less. So why not just walk away from it, quietly wind it down, go back to selling games the old way, and stop bleeding money? Microsoft can't, and that's the trap. For nearly a decade, Game Pass wasn't just a product, it was the entire identity of Xbox. Every keynote, every acquisition, every strategy slide was built around it. Microsoft bought Bethesda for $7.5 billion and Activision for $75 billion, largely to feed it. You can't spend that kind of money, stake your whole brand on one idea, and then turn around and admit the idea didn't work. The sunk cost isn't just financial, it's reputational. Killing Game Pass would mean confessing that the most expensive bet in the history of the industry was a mistake. So instead, Microsoft is doing the thing companies always do when they're stuck. They tinker, they rebrand. In the last year alone, they've reshuffled the tiers, cut the price, pulled Call of Duty off day one, restyled the very logo, and started bundling Game Pass into other services like Discord, hunting for any path to growth that doesn't involve admitting the core model is broken. None of it touches the actual problem, because the actual problem isn't the price or the logo or the bundle, it's the math, and you can't rebrand your way out of math. That's what makes this so different from a normal corporate stumble. A bad product gets discontinued, a failed feature gets quietly removed, but Game Pass is too big to kill and too broken to scale. It isn't a service that's dying, it's a service that's frozen, stuck at 40 million subscribers, too important to abandon and too flawed to ever become what it promised. So the real question was never whether Game Pass disappears. It's what Microsoft does now, trapped between a dream it can't reach and a retreat it won't say out loud. So where does that leave Game Pass? Not dead. 40 million people still pay for it every month, and that's a real business. But it's also a monument to a promise that never came true. Microsoft set out to build the Netflix of gaming, a service that would reach 100 million subscribers and change how the whole world buys games. 9 years and more than $80 billion later, it's stuck at 40 million, cutting prices, pulling back its biggest game, and quietly hoping nobody connects the dots. And here's the part worth sitting with. None of this happened because Microsoft was careless, or cheap, or didn't try hard enough. They tried harder than anyone ever has. They had the deepest pockets in the industry. They bought the biggest studios on earth. They put the most popular game in the world on the service for free. They did everything the strategy required, and it still didn't work. That's the whole point. This wasn't a failure of effort. It was a failure of the idea. Because television and gaming are not the same thing, and they never were. You can watch 100 shows in a month and never think twice about the subscription. You play one great game for 2 months and then you're gone. A show costs a few million to make. A game costs a few $100 million. The model that turned Netflix into a giant was always going to break the moment you bolted it onto games, and the only thing Microsoft's billions really bought was a very expensive proof of exactly that. The people who make the games saw it. The publishers who sell them saw it. The regulators who investigated it wrote it down in black and white. And buried in Microsoft's own files, the company saw it too. Everyone saw it, except the executives who staked the entire future of Xbox on pretending it wasn't there. So no, Game Pass probably isn't going anywhere tomorrow. Microsoft will keep adjusting the price, keep reshuffling the tiers, keep insisting the next version is the one that finally clicks. But the number tells the truth, the marketing never will. It stopped at 40 million. And it stopped for a reason that no price cut, no acquisition, and no rebrand can ever fix. Game Pass was never going to be the Netflix of gaming, because gaming was never going to be television. And somewhere in Redmond, after $75 billion, they're only just starting to admit it.